And tonight we're going to be hearing from Dr. Spencer about just how monotheistic was biblical Israel. And you have the floor.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here on a August summertime night. I appreciate your being here. So the question is just how monotheistic was biblical Israel? And just like any lecture that starts out with a question, the answer is it really depends what you mean by monotheistic or what the word monotheism means. But generally the answer is probably not, depending on how you would understand the word monotheism. First, let's consider the call of the Bible, which is to say, all those moments where the Bible says the reader or the worshiper should be monotheistic or worship Yahweh alone. For example, or at least recognize Yahweh alone. For example, in 1 Samuel 2 verse 2, they say, "There is none beside you." In 2 Samuel 7:22, "There is no God except you, according to all that we have heard with our ears." And then again, "You alone are God of all the kingdoms of the earth. You alone are God," in 2 Kings 19. And here we get explicitly in Nehemiah 9:6, the deity's name Yahweh. You alone are Yahweh. So we see here, and this is just a select body of verses that attest to the idea that only Yahweh, the God of biblical Israel, should be worshipped. But the question then really is, how monotheistic was biblical Israel? And again, the question depends on how we define our terms. Usually today when we talk about monotheism, or one God, to break the word down into its roots, we accept that there is only one divine being with no exceptions. Unfortunately, this is difficult to come by in the world. For example, in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, we have angels and we have saints that can intercede on behalf of the faithful to the deity. Are those immortal or at least non-dying beings of another world the equivalent of gods from other theological systems? Or is it because they're wholly subservient to the divine, are they discounted even though you can appeal to them and they appeal to God? So is there a full-fledged practical monotheism, or is monotheism simply the theoretical idea that only one God reigns and reigns supreme alone without any competition? In truth, monotheism is a belief. So you can't measure or gauge anyone for being a monotheist unless they just simply say, I am or I am not. What you can gauge is whether they act or worship or pray as though they only revere one deity. And this is what we would refer to as henotheism, again meaning one God, or monolatry, the worship of one God. With henotheism or monolatry, you may worship only one God, you may believe in only one God, but you may also allow for other people to have other gods. You simply do not acknowledge their power over you, or you do not revere them. For example, King David would have been a devotee of Yahweh, the God of Israel, but he would have allowed for a deity in Moab named Chemosh that the Moabites could have worshipped. Or Moses might have allowed for Pharaoh to have his Egyptian gods, even if Moses himself did not worship those gods. So that's the difference. Monolatry is the practice of worshiping one God. The other is the belief that there only one God exists. And we have, from the same book, we have some verses that will help clarify this for you. Deuteronomy 4:35, it says, "To you was shown," oh, I have a typo here. "To you it was shown so that you would acknowledge Yahweh is God. There is no other besides him." In contrast, we have Deuteronomy 32:8. When the Most High, or Elyon, apportioned the nations, he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the people according to the number of gods. So here in chapter 32, verse 8, there's one God that Israel is supposed to revere, but they allow for the possibility that other peoples or other nations have their own gods. And this is not in conflict for Moses' audience. As long as they worship Yahweh, all is well. Others can worship others. That's the clarion call. That's the main idea of Mosaic law and idealism. And that's what the Bible aspires for. Another way you might think of the difference between monotheism and monolatry is to think about Exodus 20, one of the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods in addition to me, which is a possible translation. Or you shall have no other gods before or in front of me, which is to say they can take a second tier or an outside tier position, not denying them altogether. So that is our difference. And over the course of the next few minutes, my focus will be on henotheism or monolatry, which is to say, I think the ancient Israelites were, for the most part, singly devoted to Yahweh. However, starting already with the period of the Judges, after Moses has died and Joshua has led everyone into Canaan, we get this statement from the author of Judges, or the writer summarizing everything. He says in chapter 2, verse 11 through 15, Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh and worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned Yahweh and the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked Yahweh to anger. And they abandoned Yahweh and worshipped Baal and the Astartes. So here our author, or our editor in Judges, blames the Israelites for worshiping the deities of their neighbors. And here he refers to them as Baal in the singular, or Baals in the plural, and Astartes, a goddess, in the plural. But you got to wonder, what exactly does he mean? He's making a very global statement here, and over the course of this chapter, he does not provide evidence. If you scale back and look at the whole of Judges, you become familiar with this Judges cycle. The Israelites fall into idolatry, worshiping other deities. Yahweh has them put in captivity or oppressed by their neighbors. And then ultimately they repent, and Yahweh delivers them with a judge or a hero. And then they worship Yahweh exclusively for the brief moment before they fall back into this cycle again. And this is the setup that he gives us, but the author of Judges only gives us 3 instances over the course of his book of Israelites actually worshiping non-Yahweh deities. So he has 3 examples. One is in chapter 5, it's in the song during Deborah's military campaign. One is in chapter 6 in reference to Gideon taking down an altar devoted to Baal. And then we have a story in Judges 17 and 18 where a Danite, or an Israelite, builds an idol, and then some people steal him away and worship the idol. So that's 3 instances of idolatry by a small group of people. However, our author has to say there was a dozen judges for whom this cycle applies to, but he offers no evidence for why these judges were necessary, because he offers no evidence of how the Israelites actually worshipped non-Yahweh deities. He simply has his editorial additions, and the Israelites fell into idolatry. So he makes his case, he sets it up, but he just doesn't provide us with actual evidence of non-Yahwistic or polytheistic, if you will, multiple gods revered by the Israelites. In 2 Kings, or throughout the books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, we find numerous other calls that Israel worshipped Baal and Asherah and other deities revered by the nations. And we see here in 2 Kings 23 where King Josiah, near the end of the 7th century BC, he tries a religious reform, cleaning up the religious practices of the Israelites, or here, the Judahites. It says in chapter 23, 24 and following, "Moreover, Josiah did away with the mediums, wizards, teraphim, idols, and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, so that he established the words of the law. Still Yahweh did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, by which his anger was kindled against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather, had provoked him. Yahweh said, I will remove Judah out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will reject this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I said, my name shall be there." So here, even though Josiah cleans up and gets rid of all the illicit worship throughout the land of Judah and the surrounding area, Yahweh's wrath is incurred because apparently, according to our author, too many people, too many Judahites and Jerusalemites were worshiping other gods, or they were worshiping in illegitimate places. So that's part of it. And then earlier in the text it says, in the same chapter, in verse 12, "And the altars on the roof of the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah made, and the altars that Manasseh made in the 2 courts of the house of Yahweh, Josiah pulled them down from there and broke them into pieces, threw them into rubble into the Wadi Kidron. The king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, to the south of the Mount of Destruction, which King Solomon of Israel had built for Astarte, the abomination of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He, or Josiah, broke the pillars in pieces, cut down the sacred poles, or Asherahs, and covered the sites with human bones." So again, in the same chapter we have a description of Josiah, the faithful king, whose heart was like David's, cleaning up illicit worship throughout Israel, or at least throughout Jerusalem and Judah. And he's praised for this. But again, notice what he does. He tears down altars on the roof. He tears down altars that Manasseh had put up in high places, which is to say, somewhere besides the temple in Jerusalem. We have, around the year 700, when King Hezekiah, so about 70 years or 2 or 3 generations before this story, Hezekiah solidified all of Yahweh worship into the one temple in Jerusalem and declared all other worship of Yahweh illegitimate. And this seems to have bothered our author. He sees the legitimate worship in Jerusalem as the only place that anyone can worship his deity. So even if you're worshiping Yahweh in a high place or on the roof of the temple or the king's palace or any altar that Manasseh had built, this wasn't legitimate Yahweh worship. And for our author of 2 Kings, it seems to suggest that if it's not worship of Yahweh in the right place, it's not really worship of Yahweh. And so he adds that, and then you see he also adds the statement, "And people worshipped the gods that Solomon had built there, Astarte for the Sidonians, Chemosh for the Moabites, and Milcom for the Ammonites." So again, we have the king building inappropriate Yahweh worship places or inappropriate other gods, but in the site of Jerusalem. This is not necessarily something where everyone all throughout Judah was coming to worship. So either the king is worshiping or people are worshiping Yahweh somewhere else. Think of this being, if you were to say, you can't worship Christ in a non-Presbyterian church. And so anyone who's worshiping outside of a Presbyterian church from this person's point of view is not worshiping the correct God. Even if the people inside that other church think that they're worshiping the same God as the Presbyterians. The Presbyterians have made this decision and condemned anyone who's not a part of it. I'm not blaming the Presbyterians for anything. I just thought that would be the easiest example, as that's where we are right now. And again, we see in 2 Kings 17, the author explains the whole reason that the northern state of Israel was destroyed in the late 8th century is because, again, they had high places and pillars for Asherah, and they worshipped idols. So, again, we don't know how extensive or expansive this worship was. Was it just the elites? Was it just the king of Israel and his people? Or was it the whole people? Or was it they weren't worshiping in Jerusalem, so anywhere where they were would necessarily be illegitimate in our author's mind? And then we get another idea. This is a little bit later. Ezekiel was writing during the 6th century. He lived in Babylon, having been exiled from Judah and Jerusalem at the beginning of the 6th century BC. And he has this vision in chapter 8. Ezekiel's very famous for his visions. And here's another one of them. And I've kind of cut it down to save time. Starting with verse 1, part 2. As I sat in my house, with the elders of Judah sitting before me, the hand of Yahweh God fell upon me there. And the Spirit lifted me between earth and heaven, and brought me in vision of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, to the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. Notice here, Ezekiel is having a vision of being in Jerusalem. He's not actually in Jerusalem. He's miles and hundreds of miles away. So he's not exactly an eyewitness to what he's about to tell you in the following verses. And then resuming with verse 12, then he said to me, Mortal, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of images? So reference to idol worship here. And he said also to me, you will see still greater abominations that they are coming. Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of Yahweh. Women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Tammuz was a Babylonian deity. And then he said to me, have you seen this, O mortal? You will see greater abominations than these. So Ezekiel makes witness to women worshiping or performing rituals, rather, for the god Tammuz. But again, he's hundreds of miles away in Babylon rather than in Jerusalem actually witnessing these events. So we don't know, despite his condemnation, we don't know what he's actually responding to. So from the biblical point of view, the idea is definitely that prior to the exile or the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 586 BC, the Israelite people as a whole, including all the Judahites as a whole, were polytheists, or they revered multiple deities. We have the Israelites being blamed for worshiping the god Baal in the famous story in 1 Kings 18, where Elijah, as the prophet for Yahweh, fights the 450 prophets of Baal in a sacrifice game. Elijah says, we won't use any matches or sticks. You just have your God call down the fire, and the deity who burns up the offering first wins. The prophets of Baal, over the course of the day and many lashings and failures, get nothing. Then Elijah shows off by pouring 12 buckets of water on his sacrifice. The fire rains down and licks up every bit of the offering, so that Elijah wins. But the point of the story is not just that Yahweh defeats Baal because he can actually activate and affect the sacrifice. The point of the story is that the Israelites all around would have followed Baal if it weren't for Elijah's display. But again, if we dig a little deeper, look a little closer, we see that this Baal worship was instilled by the Queen Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab. And she was not an Israelite. She was a Phoenician. So it's not necessarily that the Israelites were worshiping Baal as much as their queen was. But our author, because the queen is guilty of worshiping someone besides Yahweh, all the people are guilty. Large brushstrokes are what our authors make. And in that same passage, he also accuses the Israelites, our author accuses them of worshiping the goddess Asherah, about which we'll speak more in a moment. And then as we saw in 2 Kings 17 and 23, they worshipped false gods, they worshipped in illegitimate places, the high places, and they worshipped Baal and other deities. So the Old Testament, at least the book of Kings, wants you to know, and the book of Judges wants you to know, that the Israelites worshipped everyone but just Yahweh. And that's the case that the Bible makes out for us. So I've mentioned the name Baal several times already, or Baal, like as in base, basket, or foot, if you prefer that from your Sunday school memory. Baal was the ruler of the gods in the region of the Levant or the Syrian coast and into Israel from about sometime in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC down through the time of the Jerusalem exile and longer on, but this is the period we're interested in. He's not the creator god of the universe in the Canaanite or the Ugaritic text. And I say Ugaritic because there was a city named Ugarit where we have a lot of texts and myths written about the god Baal. So he was a second-generation deity who, after a course of various events, was appointed to be the ruler of the gods by the high god, the father of the gods. So we know a story of his rise to power. And we know that he was worshipped in Ugarit, again, which is on the coast of Syria. And it thrived from the 15th to the 13th centuries BC. And he was worshipped also by the Phoenicians from the 11th century on down in time. And literally the name Baal means Lord or Master. And so this is more of a nickname or a title. The god himself, his name probably was originally Hadad or Adad, the storm god. I mentioned the god El. He was actually the father and creator god in the Canaanite understanding of the world and the Ugaritic understanding of the world. He seems to have been the old deity who, upon his retirement, eventually appoints Baal to be the replacement head of the gods. And as the retired head deity, this is the prototype from which we think about God today as the old man in a robe with a large white beard. He was referred to something like Daniel mentions the Ancient of Days. This was the god El in Ugarit. So he was the old god. He is the big man in the sky with all the white hair. But he gave up control to Baal, and he was worshipped, but he wasn't actively worshipped as much as Baal. He wasn't as respected. He was the ex-president, if you will. And again, since Baal means Lord or Master, and is more of a title, here, curiously enough, the name El is simply the same word as God. So whether it's a title or a personal name or what have you, they all seem to be fused together in much the same way when most Americans say God. They see it as both the deity's name and the deity's job. So this was El. A third deity that we've mentioned already is the goddess Asherah. And she, in Ugaritic stories, is El's wife. She is the mother of the generation of gods that populate the Canaanite and Ugaritic world. And so think of her as the first lady, or perhaps the queen mother, once the other gods take over for El and Baal rules. Although, oddly enough, even though El is the father of the gods, Baal is not actually the son of El. He's this outsider god that seems to have come to power in Ugarit, which makes for a confusing thing. He seems to have two lineages. Question?
I was just thinking as you were going through all these, now that, we were all raised, with Yahweh as God, and these different cultures being raised with these different gods, who's really to say who's right, who's wrong, and all that?
Well, to say who's right and who's wrong, we're looking from an Israelite perspective. I'm not aiming to say who's right or who's wrong. We're looking at Israelite perspective, who they are supposed to follow.
I'm for the God we worship.
Right.
Thinking, if you were raised with one of these other gods, that's all you knew.
Right. If you're raised with these other gods, that's all you knew. For the time period of the exilic period, during this monolatrous mindset, the Israelites do allow for other countries to worship other gods, and that was okay in this time period. So that's how right. That's how I'm distinguishing what we think of as there are no other gods versus there are gods for other people.
Okay.
But Asherah here is the wife of the high god. And you'll note, if you'll recall, we go back to our Judges text. Excuse me. No, it's not on here. I'm sorry. Often in the Bible, Asherah and Baal are linked together, as though they are some kind of divine couple. Although, if we pay attention to the Canaanite mythology and Canaanite pantheon that we know of from the stories at Ugarit, Asherah was never associated with Baal. She was El's wife, not Baal. So it's curious that the Bible pairs Asherah and Baal in this way. So those are our main players for foreign gods, El, Baal, and Asherah, in contrast to Yahweh. And these are usually the characters that the authors of the biblical texts blame Israel for worshiping, the Baals and the Asherah, or the Asherahs in plural. And there are several scholars today who argue that ancient Israelites did in fact worship these multiple deities. For example, William Dever, a well-known archaeologist in Israel, he has a book, Did Yahweh Have a Wife?, in which he explores the idea that Asherah was actually Yahweh's wife or consort during this monarchic period in ancient Israel. We have also Zioni Zevit, who argues that Asherah was Yahweh's wife. And he notes also, if you read the Bible, you see all these name places or toponyms that include the name Baal, which is to say, whoever named this city or this town or this hill used the name Baal, they surely revered that deity. For example, in Numbers 32, you see mention of the place Baal Me'on, and it appears again in Joshua 13. Or you may know the story of Jacob when he sleeps on the rock in Genesis 28. He watches the angels climb up and down the stairs to heaven. He says, well, I will name this place Bethel, because this is the house of El. And literally that's what Bethel means, the house of El. So whoever named, in this case, Jacob naming the place Bethel, the idea is maybe he was more of a devotee of El rather than Yahweh. And Zevit noticed that throughout the ancient land of Israel, we have no place names that are named after Yahweh. We have Baal, we have El, we have other places, but not Yahweh. So he says the ancient Israelites must have worshipped or revered other deities, at least early on, to the exclusion of Yahweh. So that's a bit of a curiosity. Yes?
Am I right that El is kind of a root word of the area that just means a generic God? Means God.
Right. El is the root word that means God, absolutely. So it's both a common noun.
Generically. I mean
Right.
Any God.
God can be referred to as El.
Okay.
Absolutely. Just like we talk about it, any God can be referred to as God, lowercase g. So any God can be a lowercase e, El. But also this one particular God, El, it's his proper name. So again, the idea is that it looks at the place names and says, El was worshipped, Baal was worshipped, but Yahweh wasn't. So there seems to be this disconnect between the two peoples, or the worship of Yahweh and the worship of these other deities. And then Zevit also mentions other deities that he finds evidence for, including names like Dagon, or God, or Anat, or the Egyptian goddess Isis, or the god Bes and Horus. And he looks at that from personal names. We do have some evidence of an Asherah being associated with Yahweh in texts that date from approximately the year 800 BC. So before Hezekiah, before Josiah, we have these texts that were discovered in the past generation or so. One text from Khirbet el-Kom, which is in Israel. Uriah the rich commissioned it. So here's the inscription that Uriah commissioned. Blessed was Uriah by Yahweh. From his enemies, by his Asherah, he has delivered him. Written by Oniyahu, by his Asherah. So here we have a connection between Yahweh and Asherah. And this is part of why Dever and Zevit say, oh, Asherah must have been Yahweh's wife. And then we have two other texts from Kuntilat Ajrud, which is in the Sinai desert. It says, this blessing says, may he lengthen their days, and may they be satisfied. May they be given by Yahweh of Teman and by his Asherah. And then Yahweh of Teman favored them. And another text says, to Yahweh of the Teman and to his Asherah, all that he asks from a man, he will give him generously. And if he persuades, may Yahweh give to him according to his wishes. So Zevit and Dever here say, if Yahweh is going to be blessed or praised or invoked alongside Asherah, then surely she must have been his wife or his consort in this time. So according to them, Yahweh did have a wife a couple hundred years after King David, and this is their evidence. However, you'll notice it's his Asherah. So it's a little odd. It's not common, or it's not actually normal in the Bible for a proper name to get a his or a her or a possessive kind of pronoun before it. So others argue that the his means that Asherah was not an entity as much as a thing, perhaps a ritual object or a ritual pole or tree, as we'll see here in a moment. So these inscriptions are by no means evidence, say others, including myself, that Asherah was actually a wife of Yahweh. Zevit and Dever also look at famous or well-populated inscriptions and archaeology material. Notice there on your left, we have a 13th to 11th century goddess here that's referred to as Asherah in the script. This is more in Moses' time, in the time of the judges, rather than the time of the kings. But because this deity was revered here in this text, they say, look, it was here at the beginning of Israel's time in Canaan. And then they look also at the more popular objects, these female figures with the large breasts and say, oh, these were found in the cities where they were excavated from. They were found in about half of these houses. And this seems to be some kind of worship of a mother goddess of sort, like we know Asherah, the mother of the gods, to be. And they use this as evidence that the Israelites worshipped Asherah as the wife of Yahweh. However, the problem with this latter bit of evidence, in particular these 8th to 6th century figurines, other scholars have noted that they look more like good luck charms or talisman, in which they're promoting sympathetic magic, the idea that a woman with large breasts could be a symbol in the house to promote nursing for an infant. And so it's more the good luck charm than it is the deity who's being revered. So counter to this claim that so many of these objects mean Asherah was worshipped, instead this is a good luck charm, just like any rabbit's foot for our modern day equivalent, or the good luck penny, or whatever else we might think of today. So this seems to be more what's going on, rather than you have here a small terracotta idol. Other reasons to reject the idea that Asherah was Yahweh's consort is to note that Asherah was not worshipped anywhere else during the first millennium or during the time of the Israelite monarchy. So it's peculiar that a goddess Asherah would be worshipped just in Israel, but not among her neighbors, where she had been originated as a goddess a few hundred years prior. And she would not be worshipped at any time elsewhere throughout the first millennium, down to the time of Jesus. Also, you'll notice, and if you recall, Josiah and Hezekiah, when they were doing their religious reforms, they would cut down or burn down these Asherahs, which is to say, the Bible presents them as objects rather than as entities. So they are things that have been made that can be destroyed, rather than a God who exists and just happens to have an idol. So again, it seems to be more the ritualistic or worship objects rather than the God herself or the goddess herself. And another thing worth noting is that Asherah was partnered with El at Ugarit several hundred years prior to Israel's emergence or Israel's monarchic period. So why would Yahweh then come in and steal away the consort or the wife of the god El? This isn't unheard of. We have the god Ashur. He would take the Sumerian god Enlil, would take his wife Ninlil as a wife over the course of the 2nd and 1st millennium BC in ancient Mesopotamia, but it's something that should cause us to pause. And it should cause us to wonder, who was Yahweh and what was his relationship with El, that some scholars would say he took over El's wife. And this question is another question. Who was El? Who was Yahweh that Asherah could switch allegiance, if you will? Some scholars say that Yahweh, back before the Israelites emerged as their own nation, worshiping that deity, that Yahweh was a second-tier god like Baal, or a second-generation god who started out in a lowly position and then rose to prominence and displaced El and took his wife as a trophy of sorts. So this is one model of how Yahweh came to be a national god and then the God of Israel. In contrast, the idea is perhaps Yahweh and El were seen to be the same God. So it's not that Yahweh arose out of obscurity and actively pulled away El's consort, as much as people said, oh, El means God, Yahweh's a God, so why can't Yahweh be El? Or El be Yahweh? And the Bible seems to suggest this as a possibility. Notice in Joshua 22, there on your right-hand side, it says, El of the gods is Yahweh. Or another way you might translate is, God of the gods is Yahweh. And God of gods, just like you think of Heart of hearts or Holy of holies, means the highest or the greatest of the gods. So here we might have a double entendre. Yahweh is the God El, but also Yahweh is the greatest of the gods. Or we have also in Exodus chapter 6, when Moses and the deity are talking, he says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, which means God Almighty, but my name is Yahweh. I did not make myself known to them as Yahweh. So here he's saying, back in the older days, I was El, but they didn't know my true name. They just knew my job. And here I'm telling you my name. And so it could be that the Israelites saw this and said, oh, this God that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob knew as El, we now know as Yahweh. And they made the connection. And this is why the Bible never has any condemnation of El worship, because everyone recognized that they were one and the same. And this could make sense in that the name Israel itself, according to the Bible, means he struggled with El. And that's what the El is at the end of the word, a reference to this deity. So it's entirely possible that Yahweh is El in the biblical mind. Or at least by the time all our biblical authors were writing about this, they seemed to identify El with Yahweh. The other idea that Yahweh was a second-tier God who rose to prominence and stole or became victorious over El is supported perhaps by Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9, which we looked at moments ago. It says, when the Most High, or Elyon, apportioned the nations, when he divided mankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples, according to the number of the gods. And Yahweh's own portion was his people, Jacob, his allotted share. So some people read this and say, look, Most High, or Elyon, is a separate deity from Yahweh in this story, or in this poem. And you have the contrast. Elyon is the one who assigns the gods, and Yahweh's assignment is Israel. So if that is a possible if that is a plausible interpretation, then we see here Yahweh's the second-tier God taking on his assignment from the Most High. Of course, the traditional reading of this is Most High, or Elyon, is simply another name for Yahweh, in which case Yahweh assigns all the gods and assigns himself his favorite Israel, and then gives any other gods to the other peoples. So while the Bible seems to be content accepting El as Yahweh, the Bible, as we've mentioned, has a big grudge of sorts, or I don't know what other word I want, uncomfortability with the god Baal. As I mentioned, Jezebel in 1 Kings 18, she installs the god Baal, her native god, when she moves to Israel and Samaria. And the two have it out. But it's possible, even if Jezebel is worshiping Baal, the Phoenician storm god, that any other Israelite who heard this deity's name could understand it as a name for Yahweh. Just like El can be a proper name and a common name, or a common noun, so too Baal can be the god's title, or it can simply mean Lord. And Hosea seems to make reference to this possibility. He says, in that day, declares Yahweh, you will call me my man, or my husband, depending on your translation, and you will no longer call me my Baal, which is another name or another word for husband. So here Hosea is saying, it's not about that you're worshiping Baal instead of Yahweh, you're just calling him the wrong name. So if you recognize that Yahweh is your man and not your Baal, you get your terms straight, but because you've got your gods understood. So it may be sometimes Baal was another god. It may be sometimes Baal was a name or an alternative title for Yahweh, the God of Israel. And we can do a quick study of personal names to see how these may alternate back and forth. For example, King Saul, King David's predecessor, his famous son and David's best friend was Jonathan. The name Jonathan means Yahweh gave. J-O or Yo or Joe being an abbreviation of the name Yahweh. So in this regard, King Saul seems to be a good Yahwist. He worships the one true God of Israel and does so unapologetically. However, he has another son named Ishbaal, which literally means man of the Lord or man of Baal. Now, if Saul is a Yahwist, this could be a reference to Yahweh, but just by another title, rather than a reference to a separate god altogether. And also, Jonathan's son is named Merib-Baal. So, it could be a name for the god Baal, or it could be a title for the god Yahweh. And Saul's uncle is simply called Baal, which presumably is a reference to Yahweh is the Lord. Yes?
Well, you're pronouncing it Baal, like two syllables, so sounds like the second syllable is Al or El.
No, here I do mean to just be Baal, the name, rather than...
So the Baal doesn't have a connection with El?
No, in the Hebrew you have a different consonant to separate them out for you. We just don't pronounce those consonants in English, so it gets lost. That being the difference. So it seems Baal can be a name, or Baal, however you prefer, can be a title for the name for the God Yahweh. So these gods that the Israelites might have worshipped, be they Baal, Asherah, or El, when you look at the personal names of Israelites, you see, at least from the names that have been uncovered in archaeological digs and other archaeological sites, you see out of the 426 names that included divine names and personal names, most of them to a large extent, 350 out of 425, give or take, are Yahweh names. So people are naming their children and identifying that child with Yahweh, just like the Assyrians would do with their gods. Esarhaddon, the king in the early 7th century, in Ashurbanipal, their name includes the god Ashur. And then as well, Esarhaddon's son is Ashurbanipal. His other son is Shamash Shum-Ukin, or a reference to the sun god Shamash. So people can name their children in a polytheistic society after any deity they please. They don't have to name it after the deity that they are closest to or themselves were named after. Or if you look at the Phoenician king from a later period, Eshmunezar, he's named after the Phoenician god Eshmun, even though his mother was a priestess for the goddess Astarte. So you didn't have to name your child after the god that you worshipped primarily or even worked for. You could name your child after any deity you wanted to. Despite this, our Israelites seem to name all their children with the name Yahweh in those names. With, again, 350 out of the 425 that have been discovered being Yahweh names. Another 50 being El names, which could be a reference to the high God or another name for Yahweh, or it could just be the generic God as in my God, like the name Elijah. Yahweh is my God. So between the El and the Yahweh names, almost all Israelites name their children by the national God. So it suggests they had no allegiance at all or no interest in non-Yahweh gods, which is to say they worshipped or revered exclusively Yahweh. Now you'll also notice that there are 6 Baal names, and this is a significant minority, but it's not even 2% of the discovered names. So it's a relatively small, whether we say this is another name for Yahweh or whether we say this is a separate God. And if you look at King Ahab and his infamous wife from the Bible, Queen Jezebel, who's known, we've mentioned several times, 1 Kings 18, where she brings the 450 prophets of Baal. Ahab and Jezebel, they named their children with Yahwistic names. So Ahaziah, or Yahweh holds, or Jehoram, Yahweh is exalted, or Athaliah, Yahweh has manifest his glory, or perhaps it means Yahweh is just. We're not really sure what the non-Yahweh part of her name is, but it's Athaliah, Ia being a reference to Yahweh. So even the Bible's most famous anti-Yahwist, whom the Bible says ordered all the prophets of Yahweh killed after the story of Elijah versus the prophets on Mount Carmel, even she names her children after the God Yahweh. So it makes you wonder, how Yahwistic was Israel? It seems very Yahwistic. So if you add El plus Yahweh of these 426 names, you have about 95-96% of the people name their children after the national God. And this is about the same percentage of names that we find in the Bible as well, for names that include personal or divine names in them. And if we look at other inscriptions and other references to Israel from their contemporaries, for example, the Moabite stone, which is written by another people altogether, the Moabites in the 8th century, they refer to Yahweh as the national God of Israel. The Moabite stone does not mention any other gods. And if you find signature seals or stamps, the Israelites, unlike their neighbors, only have one deity on those stamps if they have deities, as opposed to the Canaanites that will have multiple deities on the stamps. The Israelites either have one or none. Again, suggesting that the Israelites had no other gods and that they didn't create an image for their God. So it really seems, from the name evidence and from the external evidence from outsiders, that the Israelites really did just worship Yahweh and acknowledge Him as their one divine sovereign. So in this regard, Israel seems to be monolatrous or monotheistic of sorts. Yes?
But did they believe that the Canaanites' gods were gods? They just didn't worship them?
Did they believe the Canaanite gods were gods but just didn't worship? That's, as I said at the beginning, monotheism is about belief. Monolatry is about practice. So we can't ask them what they actually believed. We can only judge the evidence they left behind. So I can't say flat out they were monotheistic, but they seem to revere Yahweh, and they don't care about the power or the legitimacy of any other gods. So it's a fine line, but that's as close as I can come. They seem to be monolatrous, or they seem to be Yahweh exclusive during this period. Contrary to what the Bible suggests and contrary to what many scholars today would suggest. They seem to be very Yahweh focused. And again, I can't quite, because we can't talk to them, tell you, does that count as monotheism? How legitimate were those other gods? I don't know. But they don't seem to talk about them. They don't seem to show up in literature. There's no mythology in the Bible to suggest that the other gods had a place and they just lost their place. It's all just Yahweh focused. Which reminds me, I mentioned the Ugaritic literature about Baal. He's a second-tier god. He rises to prominence. We have the battles that he faces. We meet him in the divine assembly where El says, "You will be the next leader of the council." So we have this mythology of this rise to power. We have stories of gods being born in other civilizations. Marduk of Babylon. We know he's born of other gods. We know he fights the primordial goddess Tiamat to become king of the gods in Babylon. We don't have origin stories or rise of power stories for Yahweh. So we just start out with Genesis 1 and Yahweh creates, or God creates, rather, without a conflict, without a rise to power, without being born of nature as the neighboring gods were. So it may be Yahweh was understood very differently from this period on already as substantially different. He's not a product of nature, he's the creator of nature. Whereas the other gods, be it Ashur, Marduk, or Baal, or to Europe, Zeus or Jupiter, they're not born into this world. He creates this world. But it's again hard to identify what the actual answer is. I'll close with this. I mentioned a text earlier that said, "I bless you by Yahweh and by his Asherah." And I mentioned that some scholars said this seems to be a reference to God's wife. And I said grammatically it makes more sense as an object than it does as a wife. And then I said, well, maybe El can be another name for Yahweh. Maybe Baal can be a title that the Israelites understood as a reference to Yahweh. And in that same place where we discovered at Kuntilat Ajrud, that same place we discovered the "I bless you by Yahweh and his Asherah," this poem, unfortunately, it's a little broken, but this poem showed up. And I'll read it for you with a bit of a literal translation to it. "And when El shines forth in the heights," Yahweh, and we lost what Yahweh says or does, "the mountains will melt and the hills will crush the earth. The Holy One over the gods, prepare yourself to bless Baal on the day of battle, to the name of El on the day of battle." So, if we were trying to read this very literally and trying to look for polytheism, you could say we have at least 3 different gods mentioned here. We have El, we have Yahweh, we have Baal, we have this reference to the name of El, so we'll count that towards El, and then we have this deity, Holy One. So if you wanted to say the Israelites in the year 800 BC were polytheistic, you could offer this evidence. However, if you understand how common nouns and nicknames can work, or titles can work, we can translate it this way as well and think of it as a very monotheistic statement. And when God shines forth in the heights, that is Yahweh, the mountains will melt, the hills will crush the earth. The Holy One, that is Yahweh, over the gods, something, prepare yourself to bless the Lord on the day of battle. Something to the name of God on a day of battle. This poem reads very monotheistic or monolatrous, if you want it to. And so it's again how you approach the text. If you're willing to say, oh, I think this is a best answer for the Israelites, I'll read it as monolatrous. Or if you prefer to say, there surely were other deities that the Israelites worshipped, I will think of this as polytheistic. You can do that. Just like when we looked at Deuteronomy 32. Elyon apportioned the gods, and Yahweh's portion was Israel. Or is it Elyon, that is Yahweh, portioned the people, and Yahweh's portion for himself was Israel? I tend to think that the evidence suggests the Israelites were exclusively, or at least primarily, Yahwistic. There may have been some kings or some foreign queens worshiping other deities, but the Israelites as a whole, as a people, did worship Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes.
It seems to me that throughout, well, maybe not throughout the Old Testament, but there are so many instances where both the name God and Yahweh are spoken in the same breath.
Right.
In particular with the Shema. So it looks to me like it's more of some kind of influence of understandings of deity and different names.
Right. The idea that Yahweh and the name God can happen in one breath, or in the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." The phrase "the Lord God" happens all over the place. All you have to do is open to Genesis 2, and you already find that pairing, the Lord God, which is a translation of the Yahweh God. There, the name, when the word "your God" or God follows the Lord or Yahweh in your biblical text, that's the word Elohim, which is another word in Hebrew that means God, but it's different from El as God. So there it seems to be the Lord, think God lowercase, remind you Israel, that's your God. So he takes his personal name and his title together in that regard. Right. Yes, please.
Is Elohim plural?
The question is Elohim plural? Anyone who's had an introduction to Hebrew would say "im" at the end of a word is plural. So Elohim can and does literally mean gods, plural. And we do occasionally find in the Old Testament verbs that we would expect for a plural noun. So in English, it'd be "he plays, but they play." So we can have Elohim plays or Elohim play, if we were to do that into our language. So Elohim can be plural, but most of the time it does take a singular verb when it's acting. So it seems the biblical author and biblical audience understood Elohim as a singular, even though if you spell it out, it looks plural. If that answer makes sense to you.
Well, yes, but why would they even use the plural at all?
Why would they use the plural at all? One of the best guesses would be, or a parallel for us would be to think of the royal we, where the king says we are not, or the queen says we are not amused. And if you think about this, it's not unlikely, because when we say the Lord, where Yahweh is translated as the Lord, the Hebrew substitution for Yahweh is Adonai, which literally is my Lord's plural.
Really?
So the Hebrew tradition, Jewish tradition, has this royal we that they use for the substitute of the singular Yahweh. And so that seems parallel or comparable to the Elohim as a plural, even though it seems and acts singular.
And did you just say that Adonai is plural?
The word Adonai, which typically you see translated as the Lord or my Lord, literally is my Lord's. It'd be Adoni, as if it were singular, but it's Adonai.
Could the Elohim have anything to do with the Trinity as we know it?
The Elohim have anything to do with the Trinity? From a Trinitarian perspective, if you jump in to the Bible, say at Genesis 1:26, let us make man in our own image. Trinitarians tend to say, oh, look, you have plural we, that's a reference to the Trinity. From a biblical Old Testament perspective, that could just be God talking to angels, or God talking to a divine council that is subordinate to him. So saying Elohim is plural or not plural, there's several possible answers, or just again the idea that Elohim is simply singular. That's more the interpreter or the modern reader's take on it than something that's native to the text.
Wouldn't the primary argument that the Jews would make is that we are polytheists?
The idea that Christians are polytheists from the perspective of a Jew, or we might add perspective of the Muslim. That from a Jewish and Muslim point of view is a very valid idea. Even if in Christianity we refer to Father, Son, and Holy Ghost as one substance, we talk about the triune Godhead. And from an outsider perspective, right, Christianity is not a true monotheism because it has the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. Any other questions?
During that polytheistic time, was there a prejudice were you on the right team if you worship so-and-so, and were those on the opposite team persecuted in any way?
Okay, so we're in polytheistic times. If you worship one deity, do you then dismiss or judge other populations worshiping other deities?
And perhaps even persecuted.
Or persecuted. In classic polytheism, no. Polytheism in and of itself is a very accepting theology. Think about the Greeks. They had Zeus, they had Athena, they had Apollo. Each town or each person or region had a deity that it worshipped primarily, or maybe even exclusively. But they recognized that other people had other deities. And so there's this tolerance. Even within the Roman Empire, there's a tolerance of other gods, as long as if I'm ruling over you as a body politic, if I'm Rome, say, or if I'm Babylon, you can worship all your gods that you want, as long as you pay respect to mine, which is to say, give me tribute in the name of my God. So pay Rome for Jupiter, or pay Babylon because you respect Marduk. That's really the extent of any kind of intolerance. As long as you respect the leader's God, you don't have to actually worship him in your home. It's really only with the advent of monotheism, like we think about monotheism, Yahweh exists, or the Christian God exists, meaning others don't, that this rise of intolerance happens. When you hear the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and others later, after the exile, after the monarchy, you say their gods are non-gods. And St. Paul in the New Testament, he refers to in Corinthians, oh, you can eat whatever meat has been sacrificed to these Greco-Roman gods because they aren't real. It's at that point of understanding when intolerance or persecution or mocking occurs, when you have the true monotheist as we think about it by belief, saying this opponent deity is false. And it seems to be that perspective that our biblical authors are writing from in, say, during the 6th century, after the exile, after Jerusalem's been destroyed. And they're taking that notion of monotheism that they have, or that we would have had, and they're projecting it back in time. And so they're saying, our ancestors from 2 generations ago in Jerusalem at the temple, they didn't have our definition of Yahweh exclusivism, therefore they were wrong. It's kind of the opposite of saying, oh, that person 400 years ago was sexist or racist for his time. More so, lesser others, but it was a different standard in that day 400 years ago in America than it is today. So if we were to judge them and say they were racist in an absolute sense, sure, people who brought slaves over were racist, but it dismisses all the variation in how people related to other races in early colonial America. So if that roundabout way and example fits your answer. Pagans were tolerant, yes.
Isn't modern day Israel still tolerant of other religions? I mean, they're not happy that the Muslims have taken over the Temple Mount with their,
So modern day Israel tolerant of other religions?
I mean, that's where the Center for Baha'i is, and nobody likes them.
Right.
The rest of the Arab world
Properly, Israel is a Jewish state. You have to record your religion on your passport and on your papers. So any official can see whether you identify as Muslim, Christian, Baha'i, or Jew, and they try not to. They make the attempt to not let there be a second-class citizen of a religious minority. But in those instances, the modern Israeli recognizes that their God is the same deity as Allah or as the Christian. Yeah, they see it as one God, even if it's different factions or different religions. You mean you might have some extremists, but for the most part, they see it as such, rather than it's conflicting religions, not conflicting deities. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.